Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2, where we continue our journey through an introduction to criminological theory by Roger Hopkins Burke. In this episode, we explore the critical criminology perspective and its focus on power, oppression, and harm. Hello again, and thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Today, we are indeed continuing our systematic exploration of Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory. We're turning the page to Chapter 12, which introduces a truly pivotal perspective in the field, critical criminology. Now, this isn't a viewpoint that just, tinkers around the edges of traditional criminology.
Not at all.
It's one that fundamentally challenges its core assumptions. It asks us to look beyond individual behavior and instead focus on the powerful forces and structures within society that might actually produce crime and, define who gets labeled as a criminal in the first place.
That's absolutely right. Critical criminology really represents one of the most significant contemporary evolutions of those radical traditions in criminology that we've touched on before. It offers a pretty stark contrast to more mainstream or, orthodox perspectives. Its real power lies in its direct challenge to the idea that crime is simply about individual pathology or just breaking laws.
Right.
Instead, it's rooted in the idea that crime is deeply, maybe even inextricably, linked to societal oppression.
Oppression. That's a heavy word, isn't it? So based specifically on the excerpts we have from Chapter 12 of Burke's book, our mission in this deep dive is to fully unpack this perspective.
Okay.
We want to understand its core ideas, explore its origins, apparently in the UK, dissect its key arguments about the relationship between power, both the powerful and the less powerful, and crime.
Yeah, that power dynamic is crucial.
And we need to delve into that controversial concept of semiology, the study of social harm, and also grapple with the criticisms this perspective faces. It's a challenging lens, for sure, but an essential one for understanding crime in a really different way. Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this core concept then. At its heart, according to our source, what is critical criminology trying to tell us? What's its foundational definition of crime?
Well, the source makes it quite clear. It places critical criminology as one of two main contemporary streams flowing from that radical criminological tradition we mentioned.
Right.
The other being left realism, which the text flags will probably get to later. But the key defining feature, the text argues, is that critical criminology has unequivocal foundations in what's termed the victimized actor model.
The victimized actor model. That phrase alone changes the frame entirely, doesn't it? It suggests that the person committing what we typically call crime is themselves, in some fundamental way, a victim of larger forces. Is that the implication?
Precisely. It shifts the starting point dramatically. Instead of asking what psychological flaw or moral failing caused this person to commit this act, the question becomes, something more like, what societal forces or structures have shaped this person's life and led them to this point? And within this model, the core definition of crime is conceptualized not primarily as law-breaking, but in terms of oppression. Crime is seen as a manifestation or maybe a consequence of oppression.
Oppression by whom, though? Or by what? Who does the source identify as suffering from this oppression within this critical framework?
The text is pretty specific here. It identifies the groups seen as suffering most directly from these oppressive social relations. Primarily, it's the working class, and particularly its poorer and most marginalized sections.
Right, the most vulnerable.
Exactly. It also highlights women, especially those facing intersecting disadvantages, poor women, sole parents, those who are socially isolated. And significantly, ethnic minority groups are included too, particularly those from non-English speaking backgrounds and refugees.
Okay.
And the source connects these experiences directly to fundamental social relations based on things like class division, sexism, and racism. These aren't seen as just random individual misfortunes, but as outcomes of structured inequality.
So, the critical lens immediately draws this line between someone's position in the social hierarchy, their class, their race, their gender, and their likelihood of being involved in what gets defined as crime, either as a perpetrator or maybe even as a consequence of their oppression somehow.
Yeah, that's the linkage it makes.
Our source then says critical criminologists examine the relationship to crime for both the powerful and the less powerful. How does this perspective connect these two often opposing groups to criminal activity?
Well, it sees crime fundamentally as linked to these broad processes of the political economy. And specifically, the source really emphasizes the role of global capitalism.
Ah, okay, the big picture system.
Exactly. Within this system, the powerful think those who control state and corporate interests are seen as engaging in activities driven by the pressures to secure and maintain their position, and crucially, to maximize profit. Their actions, even when they're harmful or technically illegal, are often framed within the pursuit of these quote-unquote legitimate capitalist goals.
Right, so their crimes might be seen as just doing business.
That's often the argument, yes. And for the less powerful, the people we've just discussed as experiencing oppression.
Yeah, what about them?
For them, criminal behavior is understood quite differently. It's seen as an outcome resulting from the interaction of two key processes. First, there's marginalization.
Marginalization, meaning pushed to the edges.
Pretty much. It means their exclusion from meaningful access to mainstream institutions, things like secure employment, decent education, adequate housing, or real political participation. They are effectively pushed to the edges of society.
Okay.
And second, this marginalization then interacts with criminalization by state authorities.
Criminalization, so the state's response itself becomes part of the problem, is that what it's saying?
Exactly. It's not just that they are marginalized passively. The state actively intervenes in ways that label their behaviors as criminal and specifically targets them for control.
How does that work in practice?
Well, the source highlights the increasing racialization of crime as a key example. It points out how law enforcement and the media, often driven by narratives around the war against crime, or perhaps concerns about public disorder, tend to focus their attention and resources on specific communities.
And these are disproportionately ethnic minority communities.
That's what the text argues, yes. This targeting, according to this perspective, serves to associate crime with these groups in the public mind, making them symbols of the crime problem, regardless of the actual distribution of offending. What's fascinating here is how critical criminologists pull these strands together into a structural argument. They aren't saying individual behavior doesn't exist, of course.
No, sure.
But they argue that offending behavior isn't some isolated phenomenon or purely a matter of individual free will or some kind of pathology. It is, they contend, fundamentally linked to a social context.
And that context is shaped by?
It's structurally determined by two major factors, according to the source. First, the general allocation of societal resources, basically. Who gets what? The distribution of wealth and opportunity. And second, the specific nature of police intervention in the lives of citizens, how the state uses its power to control certain populations.
So it's structure plus state action.
Yes. It's a model where crime is seen as a symptom of the societal structure and how the state chooses to act, not just an individual failing.
Okay. So why should you, the listener, care about this starting point? Well, because this core idea immediately flips the conventional script, doesn't it?
It really does.
Traditional criminology might start by asking, why does this person commit crime? But critical criminology starts by asking, what kind of society creates conditions where crime is a likely outcome for certain groups, and why does that society define and police crime in the way it does? It's a fundamental shift.
It absolutely is. From individual pathology to scrutinizing broader societal issues, power dynamics, and the very mechanisms of criminalization itself.
Let's trace this back a bit then. Where did this distinct critical perspective really emerge? Our source points to the late 1960s in the UK as a key period. What was the intellectual climate like among radical criminologists then?
Well, the source describes a kind of idealist view of the working class that seemed to develop among many radical criminologists at that time.
Idealist? How so?
This idealism led to an appreciation, and sometimes, the text suggests, even a degree of condoning of deviant acts committed by members of this group.
So almost seeing their deviance as a form of resistance, maybe, or justified somehow.
To some extent, yes. They were reacting against the dominant predestined actor model of the time,
Which saw offenders as
often simply determined by factors outside their control, biological, psychological, or purely environmental, and acting somewhat mindlessly. The radical criminologists proposed a different idea, that the offender's actions, even if labeled criminal by society, were actually meaningful to them.
Meaningful in what way?
As purposeful responses to their circumstances, their lived reality, which were then labeled and condemned as criminal by the dominant groups in society precisely because they challenged the existing norms and power structures. This perspective is powerfully encapsulated by a quote from Stan Cohen from 1980, which the source highlights. Cohen argued that our society, as presently structured, will continue to generate problems for some of its members, and then condemn whatever solution these groups find.
Wow. So society creates the problem
The conditions of marginalization and oppression.
and then punishes people
Right.
for how they try to cope with it.
That's the core of Cohen's critique, yes. It's a pretty damning indictment.
What kind of research or intellectual trends fed into this new idealism back then?
The source points to the influence of things like labeling theory and deviant subculture perspectives, and crucially, their reliance on ethnographic observation.
Ethnographic, meaning researchers actually going out and spending time with people.
Exactly. This involved researchers spending significant time on the ground, engaging in actual day-to-day contact with the young people they were studying, often young working-class individuals involved in activities the state considered deviant.
And what did that direct observation reveal that maybe differed from the mainstream view, sitting in an office looking at statistics?
Well, it convinced these researchers that these young people weren't just mindless automatons or inherently criminal. They saw them engaged in activities, certain behaviors, styles, ways of life that, within their own social context and subculture, they regarded as legitimate or meaningful.
But the state saw it differently.
Precisely. But these activities had been prohibited by the state and labeled as criminal, often, the argument goes, in response to wider social anxieties rather than objective harm. And this is where the concept of moral panics comes in, as the source explains it.
Ah, yes, moral panics.
Critical criminologists argued that new laws and harsher measures were often a response by legislatures not to a genuine, objective surge in dangerous behavior, but to these panics.
Which were driven by...
They were, in turn, fanned by sensational and exaggerated media reporting, amplifying fear and outrage about particular groups or behaviors. Stan Cohen's classic 1973 study of the moral panic surrounding the mods and rockers in the UK is the prime example cited here.
Right, the seaside clashes.
Yeah, the media reports massively exaggerated the scale of damage and terror they supposedly caused holidaymakers, leading to really disproportionate legal and social reactions, creating folk devils out of them.
That concept of folk devils created by moral panics is so powerful. If we bring it forward, as the source suggests we can, who might critical criminologists argue are the new folk devils targeted by similar criminalizing interventions today?
Well, the source lists several potential contemporary examples. Think about recreational drug users, maybe individuals associated with binge drinking culture, asylum seekers certainly come up, and segments of society often described dismissively as a welfare-dependent underclass. Critical criminologists would analyze how media narratives and state interventions construct these groups as threats, potentially justifying increased surveillance and control, echoing exactly the dynamics seen with past folk devils like the mods and rockers.
And this critical lens also leads to a fundamental challenge regarding official crime rates, doesn't it? You touched on this earlier.
Yes, absolutely. Critical criminologists argued these figures are not simply objective measures of the amount of crime actually being committed out there.
They're not just a neutral count.
Not according to this view. Instead, they are seen as being far more a measure of the level of police activity and the priorities and targets of the criminal justice system at any given time.
So if the police suddenly crack down on, say, cannabis use, the stats for cannabis offenses will go up, even if the actual level of use hasn't changed much.
Precisely. A reported increase in a certain type of crime might not mean more people are doing it, but just that the police are focusing more resources on finding it or labeling it that way. The source uses that specific example from Hall and colleagues back in 1978 regarding figures for street robbery in London during the 1970s.
Oh, they find.
They argued that figures suggesting Black people were disproportionately responsible for street robberies didn't necessarily reflect the actual distribution of offending. It was more likely, they argued, a result of racist police stereotyping and the targeting of specific communities for stop and search and arrest for that particular offense.
So the stats become a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
In a way, yes. It highlights the critical argument that crime statistics are social and political constructions, deeply influenced by power and bias, not just neutral facts reflecting reality.
Now, our source talks about a significant turning point in the field in the 1970s, a crisis of confidence, or maybe an ideology crisis, or what it calls orthodox criminology. What was the root cause of this crisis? Why the wobble?
Well, the fundamental problem was the failure of traditional orthodox criminological theories to adequately explain the reality they were observing on the ground. Crime statistics just kept rising. persistently upwards, year after year.
Which you'd expect theories to explain.
Right, but the kicker was this was happening even during periods of increasing societal affluence.
Ah, that's the contradiction.
Exactly. This contradicted many existing theories that linked crime primarily to poverty or lack of opportunity. Affluence should, theoretically, have led to a decrease or at least stabilization in crime, but it just didn't happen. And the source notes that for years, criminologists had been churning out, a proliferation of explanations for crime and proposing a vast array of solutions. Many of these were varied, sometimes incompatible, and often proved impractical or just plain unsuccessful in stemming the tide of rising crime.
So lots of theories, not many results.
Pretty much. The text cynically observes that the number of books and theories attempting to explain crime seem to grow in direct proportion to the increasing crime figures themselves, highlighting the field's apparent inability to really grasp or control the problem.
And then, was there a specific piece of research that seemed to crystallize this crisis, sort of tipping point?
Yes, there was the very influential observation by Robert Martinson in 1974. After reviewing numerous rehabilitation programs, he famously concluded that when it came to reducing reoffending, nothing works.
Nothing works.
It's bleak.
Incredibly bleak. And this assessment was, perhaps predictably, eagerly taken up and promoted by researchers at the British Home Office, particularly by Mayhew and colleagues in 1976. According to the source, Martinson's "nothing works" effectively became the new official orthodoxy within government policy circles.
If nothing works, in terms of rehabilitation or tackling root causes, that must have felt like a major blow to those kinds of theories. What did this perceived failure of traditional approaches lead to in terms of policy and the whole of criminology itself? Well, it ushered in the rise of what Jock Young later termed administrative criminology in 1994. The idea was essentially to abandon the ambitious and seemingly futile goal of trying to change or rehabilitate criminals.
So a shift away from trying to fix the offender or society.
Precisely. The focus shifted dramatically towards simply managing crime by reducing the opportunities for it to occur and increasing the efficiency of catching and punishing offenders when it did.
More practical, less theoretical.
That was the idea. This new approach was heavily influenced by contemporary iterations of the rational actor model, which views offenders as making calculated choices based on risk and reward. So the emphasis shifted heavily onto deterrence, surveillance, target hardening, and incapacitation through incarceration. Lock them up, basically. And this also redefined the role of academic criminologists in the eyes of policymakers. Instead of developing grand theories to explain crime or proposing expensive social programs,
Which apparently didn't work anyway.
right, their new useful function became evaluating usually pretty small-scale situational crime prevention schemes.
Like what? Better street lighting, CCTV.
Exactly. Those kinds of interventions aimed at making specific places or situations less conducive to crime. The source notes that explaining the underlying causes of crime and proposing comprehensive solutions for its elimination was now largely dismissed by policymakers as an impractical academic exercise, unworthy of funding or serious attention.
So orthodox criminology kind of retreated into crime management rather than grand theory or social reform. How did critical criminologists watching this unfold react to this crisis and the rise of administrative criminology?
Well, they argued forcefully that the earlier focus on labeling processes, while important for understanding how deviance gets constructed, wasn't sufficient on its own.
Not enough just to look at labels.
No, they contended that to truly understand crime, it was absolutely necessary to examine the deeper structural relations of power in society. Crime, they insisted, must be viewed within the broader context of social relations and the political economy.
Back to the big picture again.
Always back to the big picture. This is where, as Scraton and Chadwick articulated in 1996 and the source notes, significant work was undertaken, often drawing on Marxist perspectives, to try and identify the causal basis of crime within the very structures of capitalist society, and to link dominant institutions like the state and the criminal justice system to ruling class interests.
Okay, the source does mention a critique of some of this earlier Marxist-influenced critical work, though, that it could sometimes idealize or romanticize working-class crime as political rebellion, or maybe that it was too narrowly focused on economic class alone, ignoring other factors. How did the perspective evolve in response to these sorts of critiques?
That's a fair point, and the perspective certainly did evolve and broaden significantly. Later work moved beyond just economic determinism, thankfully. It began to explore the specific context and, crucially, the lived experiences of people involved with crime and the justice system in much greater detail.
More nuance.
Definitely more nuance. Hall and Screeton's work in 1981 is cited as an example of this shift towards understanding the complexities of life under marginalization. And crucially, critical criminology of oppression that had been largely ignored by much of academic Marxism up to that point, namely things like racism, sexism, and issues related to masculinity.
It became more intersectional, we might say now.
You could definitely frame it that way, yes. And throughout this evolution, they maintained a sharp focus on the actions of those in power, particularly what is often termed white-collar crime, or, more broadly, the crimes of the powerful. This became a real defining area of critical criminological inquiry.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think, and really highlights the difference in focus.
Hmm.
Critical criminology shines this bright spotlight on the crimes of the powerful. Our source takes us back to the origins of this concept, referencing Edwin Sutherland.
That's right. And while critical criminology definitely developed this area further within its broader structural critique, the concept itself wasn't entirely new. Edwin Sutherland, way back in 1940, was the first to coin the term white-collar crime.
What was his core idea?
His groundbreaking work essentially attacked the actions of supposedly respectable people in business and the professions. His core argument was that the harmful activities these individuals engaged in, often within the scope of their legitimate work, would absolutely have been labeled as criminal things like theft, fraud, even violence, had they been committed by individuals from the less powerful sections of society in different circumstances.
So a double standard.
Exactly. Sutherland was essentially observing and critiquing the inherent inequality in how harmful behavior was treated depending on the social status of the perpetrator. It was a radical idea for its time.
And this observation led to more dedicated research in that area.
Yes. The source notes that Sutherland's pioneering work spurred a steady increase in research interest in white-collar crime, particularly among scholars influenced by perspectives like differential association and deviant subculture theory. They explored how this kind of offending was learned and normalized within specific professional groups.
Okay.
Critical criminology then built upon this foundation, but crucially, it placed white-collar crime firmly within its larger framework, a fundamental critique of global capitalist society.
So for critical criminologists, it's not just about a few bad apples at the top, but something inherent in the system itself. How do they argue that capitalism itself is linked to corporate crime?
Well, the core argument, articulated by scholars like Swartz back in 1975, as cited in the source, is that the very drive for the maximization of corporate profits within a capitalist system means that, and this is a direct quote idea, its normal functioning produces deaths and illnesses.
Wow. It's normal functioning.
That's the claim. In other words, harmful outcomes, injury, disease, death, are not just accidental byproducts of business. They can be direct, even predictable consequences of pursuing profit above all else, particularly worker safety or environmental protection. The commission of business crime is seen as deeply intertwined with the fundamental values of capitalism and the pursuit of, quote, legitimate business goals. Mars, in 1982, reinforces this point, noting that there is often only a fine line separating what's considered acceptable entrepreneurialism and flair from what is actually sharp practice and fraud.
So the line is blurry.
Very blurry. And many activities that cause harm or involve deception are simply not met with the same level of widespread social disapproval or legal sanction as traditional street crimes. The source gives that relatable example of an electrician who overcharges a customer, often not seen or treated as a thief. Maybe just a shrewd businessman, right?
Yeah, you might grumble, but you probably wouldn't call the police.
Exactly. This illustrates how such behavior, when linked to legitimate business roles, can be excused or minimized and distinguished from the actions of perceived real criminals, even when the harm caused might be quite significant financially or otherwise.
So, activities causing substantial harm can be redefined or excused as simply part of the cost of doing business, or maybe clever enterprise, rather than being labeled and prosecuted as crime. The source also discusses corporations practicing what's called law evasion. What does that involve exactly?
Law evasion by corporations can take various forms, but it's generally designed to avoid legal restrictions or minimize costs, often at the expense of safety or environmental well-being. One key tactic mentioned is setting up factories or operations in countries with weak or even non-existent environmental pollution controls or workplace safety legislation.
Exporting the risk, basically.
Precisely. The Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, where that catastrophic gas leak in 1984 killed thousands, is cited as a grim example by Pearson Toombs. The plant's operation and safety standards were apparently far, far below what would have been required in the company's home country, the U.S.
And what about selling products that are actually banned in developed nations? Does that happen?
That's another major form of law evasion, which Braithwaite documented extensively back in 1984. Corporations based in developed countries will sell goods or products that have been banned as unsafe in their home markets to markets in the developing world.
Seriously, like what?
Well, the source gives the chilling example of the Dalkin Shield, an intrauterine contraceptive device. Despite being declared unsafe and withdrawn from the market in the USA because it caused severe health problems and even deaths, it was apparently sold overseas for a considerable time afterwards, as Hagen detailed.
That's appalling.
It is. Multinationals are effectively able to dump products, outdated plants, and harmful practices that are illegal or strictly regulated in industrialized countries onto less developed or underdeveloped countries. Places where such laws don't exist, or, crucially, where they aren't rigorously enforced. Box highlighted this back in 1987.
Why are these recipient nations so vulnerable to this kind of dumping? What factors make it possible?
The source, drawing on Braithwaite's analysis from 1984, points to several factors. Often, these nations are desperately dependent on the capital investment and jobs provided by the multinational corporations, giving the corporations huge leverage.
Economic necessity.
Yes. They often also have fewer resources, both technical and administrative, to effectively check the claims made by manufacturers about the safety or efficacy of their products or operations. And sadly, the source notes, government officials in these nations can sometimes be more susceptible to bribery and corruption, which obviously weakens oversight and enforcement.
So corporations can basically export their illegal or harmful behavior to places where it faces less resistance and scrutiny.
That's the argument. And adding to this, you have to remember that multinational corporations wield immense economic resources and political influence. Often, as Carson noted in 1980 and Box in 1983, the annual revenue or assets of a single multinational can be greater than the entire gross domestic product of some of the less developed countries where they operate.
Wow, richer than the country itself.
In some cases, yes. This gives them tremendous power to influence, weaken, or even curtail legislation or its enforcement in those host countries. Box, in his 1983 work, cited in the source, discusses how this power is maintained partly through a process he called mystification.
Mystification, making it seem less bad than it is.
Essentially, yes. This process perpetuates the myth that corporate crime isn't truly serious or harmful, or that it's just the unavoidable cost of progress or providing jobs. This narrative protects the powerful segments of society who benefit from these activities.
But Box offers a counter-narrative.
He does. He provides a powerful counter-narrative detailing the true ability of corporate crime to kill, injure, and rob on a massive scale. And he argues forcefully that the competitive environment inherent in capitalism, along with the internal promotion systems within businesses, actually encourage employees to engage in law-breaking behavior to achieve corporate goals. He's quoted directly in the source, explaining this dynamic. He says, not only does the promotion system mean that people who rise to the top are likely to have just those personal characteristics it takes to commit corporate crime, but these are reinforced by the psychological consequences of success itself, for these to free a person from the moral bind of conventional values.
That's quite an indictment. It suggests the system itself selects for and rewards rule-breaking, and success makes you feel above the rules.
That's the implication, yes. It's a powerful argument about the structural drivers of corporate harm, suggesting it's not just about individual greed, but something embedded in the culture and pressures of corporate life within capitalism.
Okay, so if we try to summarize the critical criminologist's core claim here, based on what our source is telling us, working-class crime, the kind we often focus on in the media and policy debates, is seen as relatively insignificant in terms of cost and harm when you compare it to the crimes of the powerful, which often largely go unpunished or are treated much more leniently. Is that fair?
That's the central argument, absolutely. The source lists examples of these crimes of the powerful, things like price-fixing cartels, widespread tax evasion by corporations and the wealthy, various forms of white-collar fraud, massive environmental pollution incidents, preventable deaths and injuries at work due to negligence and other regulatory offenses.
And the cost is higher?
Critical criminologists argue convincingly that these activities cost society exponentially more, both financially and certainly in terms of human suffering, death, and long-term environmental damage, than the cumulative impact of things like youth offending, street crime, burglary, or petty theft.
And presumably the gain for the perpetrators is disproportionate too.
Absolutely. The powerful perpetrators of these corporate or white-collar crimes often gain far more material advantage and wealth than those committing traditional street crimes. Plus, far fewer state resources are dedicated to investigating and combating white-collar and corporate crime compared to street crime.
That seems undeniable.
And the source points out that some highly questionable, even devastatingly harmful activities aren't even formally criminalized by law at all. They're instead portrayed as legitimate forms of enterprise and wealth creation. And finally, offenders in this category have significant advantages. They can hire expensive lawyers and accountants to exploit legal loopholes and mount vigorous defenses.
And they have connections.
And they often have powerful friends in government and business who can lobby on their behalf, ensuring they face less scrutiny and punishment than the less powerful would for comparable harm. It really exposes a fundamental inequality in the application and enforcement of criminal law.
Okay, now let's turn to the other side of that coin, the crimes of the less powerful. We discussed earlier how critical criminology links this to marginalization and criminalization. Can you elaborate a bit on the economic context here as described by the source?
Yeah, critical criminologists observe that even during periods of increasing general affluence in post-war industrial societies, like the UK, for example, a substantial minority of the population experienced persistent relative deprivation.
Relative deprivation meaning compared to others, not necessarily starving.
Exactly. While they might not have been living in absolute destitution, they were living significantly below the average and accepted standard of living enjoyed by the majority. And the definition of what constitutes relative deprivation isn't fixed. It changes over time and varies between societies. The source points out that this relative poverty continued, and arguably even deepened, because the wealthiest segments of society were taking a disproportionately large share of the economic gains.
So inequality was the persistent problem, even as the overall pie grew bigger.
Precisely. And according to critical criminologists, the attempts by these less powerful groups to claim what they saw as their just rewards, their fair share of societal resources, or maybe just to protest about their difficult situation, were frequently met with criminalization.
So their struggles were labeled as crime.
That's the argument. Their actions, whether acts of property crime perhaps stemming from need or frustration, or forms of protest against the conditions, were labeled and treated as criminal. The source cites that famous stark claim by Jeffrey Ryman back in 1979, "The rich get richer and the poor get prison," as a kind of summary of this dynamic.
How does this criminalization of the less powerful actually happen, according to the mechanism the source describes? What's the process?
Well, the core explanation for crime among the less powerful is seen as this interaction between marginalization, their exclusion, and lack of access to mainstream institutions and opportunities, and criminalization, which is the active intervention of state authorities to label and control their behaviors. The source describes this as a process where the legal system, the agencies of social control like the police, and often the media work together, maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly, to associate crime with specific groups.
And these groups are
Typically, as we mentioned, those experiencing class, race, and gender oppression. These groups are then identified, sought out, and targeted as a threat to social order. Scraton and Chadwick, writing in 1996, argued that this process serves a crucial political function. It's used, they contend, to divert public attention and concern away from the underlying economic and social conditions that are the true source of the problem.
a distraction tactic.
Essentially, yes. This is seen as particularly important during times of acute economic change or hardship, which might otherwise provide the impetus for serious political unrest or demands for fundamental societal change. By focusing on the criminals among the less powerful, the system avoids addressing the structural issues that create those conditions in the first place.
Can you provide specific examples from the text of how this diversion and criminalization of political or social responses occurs?
Sure. The source points to how overtly political protests, particularly those by marginalized groups, are often criminalized, framed simply as public disorder or rioting rather than as legitimate expressions of grievance.
Right, depoliticizing it.
Exactly. It also notes how political terrorists are frequently termed common criminals by state authorities and media outlets. This isn't just semantics. It's seen as a deliberate strategy, as Hilliard observed back in 1987, to neutralize the political nature of their actions.
Why is that distinction so important?
Well, Hilliard argued that it's much easier to mobilize public support and justify robust state intervention, like introducing draconian anti-terrorism laws or harsh policing tactics against acts labeled as purely criminal, rather than against what might potentially be perceived by some segments of the public as a just political cause, however controversial. And the consequence of this whole criminalization process is significant, and it reinforces existing inequalities. It justifies the application of harsher social control measures, specifically targeting these economically and politically marginalized groups who, precisely because of their marginalization, have very few means of resisting these initiatives effectively.
So it hits hardest those least able to fight back.
That's the claim. The source connects this dynamic to the major economic changes that took place in the last quarter of the 20th century, particularly in countries like the UK, which led to the impoverishment of significant sections of the lower, less powerful social classes, deindustrialization, unemployment, and so on.
And this group has historically been seen as a threat anyway.
Yes, the source reminds us that this group, the urban poor, the unemployed, often racialized minorities, has historically been seen and labeled as the dangerous classes since at least the beginning of the modern industrial era.
Okay.
By criminalizing their activities and framing their struggles or perhaps their survival strategies as crime, their difficult situation is then attributed not to systemic failures, but to their own individual weaknesses, their alleged laziness, inherent criminality, or moral failing.
Blaming the victim, essentially.
On a societal scale, yes. And this narrative, in turn, justifies harsher control measures against them, rather than forcing society to look critically at the structural factors like unemployment, lack of opportunity, poor housing, and systemic discrimination that contribute significantly to their situation.
This perspective goes so far as to look at the very function of crime itself and even the criminal justice system in a fundamentally different, almost paradoxical light. Our source says some critical criminologists see crime as a reassuring sign. That feels incredibly counterintuitive. How can crime be reassuring?
It certainly does feel counterintuitive on the surface, but from this critical perspective, crime is seen as a kind of persistent symptom. It's viewed as a reassuring sign that the perpetual struggle against inequality and oppression continues, a sign that the system is not entirely successful in completely suppressing dissent or disadvantage.
So its existence shows the system isn't all-powerful.
In a sense, yes. And this idea, perhaps surprisingly, finds a lineage, albeit twisted, in the work of the classic sociologist Emil Durkheim.
But he's often seen as a functionalist, someone emphasizing social solidarity and order. How does that connect to a radical critique like this?
It seems contradictory, I know, but the source references Durkheim's argument from way back in 1964, where he claimed that crime could actually be functional for the needs of society. He argued that a certain level of crime is normal and even necessary for a healthy society. It helps test its boundaries, reinforces norms when punished, and allows for social change.
He really said that.
He did. The source quotes him directly. Crime must no longer be conceived as an evil that cannot be too much suppressed. There is no occasion for self-congratulation when the crime rate drops noticeably below the average level, for we may be certain that this apparent progress is associated with some social disorder.
Wow, okay, so a society with no crime, or very little crime, might actually be more worrying in his view than one with a typical amount.
In this specific interpretation, yes. A complete suppression of all deviance might indicate an overly rigid or perhaps oppressive social structure, one unable to adapt. The source explains that this core concept of the potential functionality of crime, albeit in a very different context than Durkheim probably intended, survived and was reinterpreted within conflict theories.
How do conflict theories use it?
These theories depict crime not as a simple pathology to be eradicated, but as symptomatic of an ongoing struggle between powerful groups seeking to maintain control and weaker groups resisting or reacting to that control. From this view, this conflict, manifested as crime by the powerful, is seen as a necessary tension.
Necessary how?
Because without it, social control might become an unchecked, totalizing oppression of citizens by the state. It acts in a perverse kind of way as a pressure valve, or at least a signal of underlying problems and resistance. And this leads us into what the source describes as the left idealism perspective regarding the criminal justice system. This is a view sometimes attributed to critical criminologists, perhaps by their critics, though often originating from within the radical tradition itself, as discussed by Scranton and Chadwick in 1996.
Left idealism.
Okay.
What's the core idea there?
This perspective argues that the growing disparities between the rich and the poor and the sheer increase in the number of impoverished people in capitalist societies represents a legitimation crisis for the system. The system is visibly failing to provide for many, which fundamentally undermines its legitimacy in their eyes.
And how does the state respond to this legitimacy crisis, according to this view?
The perceived state response is a substantial move towards law and order politics. Since actual deprivation is seen as a major cause of working-class crime, the state's strategy, according to this critique, is not really to alleviate the deprivation, but to focus intensely on controlling its consequences.
Crack down harder.
Exactly. And this, they argue, exacerbates the process of identifying, criminalizing, and punishing members of specific groups within the working class and ethnic minorities, the usual suspects, if you will. From this left idealist viewpoint, the true function of the criminal justice system is therefore not what it claims to be: solving crime, protecting the public, or reforming criminals.
So what is its true function then?
Instead, its underlying function is seen as being primarily about uniting the dominant society against a deviant rump in their midst. By identifying, labeling, and punishing these groups, the state creates a common enemy.
A scapegoat.
Pretty much. Which serves to reinforce the boundaries of acceptable behavior and, in this way, helps to maintain the legitimacy of the existing social order. It's a mechanism of social cohesion built on exclusion and punishment, rather than inclusion and support.
So crime control becomes less about genuine public safety and more about maintaining the political and social status quo.
That's the core of the argument, yes. The source, referencing Foucault's influential work in 1980, states that the true function of prisons, for example, is not really to rehabilitate offenders, which statistics consistently show they are largely ineffective at doing.
Right, recidivism rates are high.
Very high. Instead, their primary function, from this perspective, is to stigmatize convicted individuals, marking them publicly as failures and casting them as the enemy within society. This reinforces the idea that the problem lies solely with them, the individuals, not with the wider system. Similarly, the true function of the police, according to this view, is not primarily to prevent crime and apprehend criminals, despite that being their stated mission and what many officers genuinely try to do.
So what's their true function?
Their core function is seen as being to maintain social order. They are deployed primarily to control situations that might threaten the established community order, things like industrial disputes, political demonstrations, or disturbances involving marginalized groups. Basically, managing dissent and keeping a lid on things. Cohen, back in 1985, is cited making the crucial point that the police are also used strategically to widen the net of social control.
Widen the net, meaning bring more people under scrutiny.
Exactly. It means the state, through its policing and criminal justice apparatus, actively brings more individuals and groups, particularly those who are potentially disruptive or simply outside the mainstream, under surveillance and control. And to achieve this extensive social control function, the source adds, referencing Scranton in 1985, the authorities, particularly the police, need significant powers and a relative degree of freedom from close control by local and central governments. This allows them the discretion they need in how they apply order maintenance and surveillance.
Okay, this is clearly a very strong and, well, deeply critical perspective. It challenges the fundamental narratives about crime and justice that we often hear and probably internalize. But our source also acknowledges, quite fairly, that many people find this view highly problematic. What are some of the significant critiques mentioned in the text?
Yeah, the source definitely notes that many critics would view this perspective on social order, the function of law, and the role of the criminal justice system as, frankly, overly simplistic and perhaps even divorced from the reality people experience.
How so?
Well, a major critique is that it's seen as a denial of the reality that most people actually experience regarding crime. It can come across as downplaying or ignoring the real harm caused by individual criminal actions.
Meaning it denies that individual criminal acts have real victims and cause real suffering, independent of any state labeling or structural analysis.
Exactly. Critics argue that the individual nature of criminality, the choices people make to harm others, cannot simply be dismissed or regarded solely as a construction of the state or an inevitable outcome of oppression. People do make choices, and those choices have consequences for others. The source itself, referencing Hopkins Burke's own work from 1998, points out that this critical view can be seen as denying the very real reality that the weaker sections of society, the very groups critical criminologists often claim to champion, actually need the protection of the law and the criminal justice system.
Needed to protect them from who?
To defend them from criminal elements within their own communities. Not all criminal behavior is some form of proto-political rebellion targeted upwards against the dominant social order. A huge amount of it is directed horizontally at other less powerful people living in the same deprived areas.
Right, intraclass crime.
Exactly. The criminal law, while undoubtedly flawed and often applied unequally, isn't solely directed at keeping the less powerful in their place. It also provides essential, albeit imperfect, protection for victims, many of whom are themselves vulnerable and marginalized. Ignoring that reality is a major criticism. And it is partly in response to these kinds of critiques the concern that critical criminology was maybe ignoring the lived reality of street crime and victimization, or perhaps was too focused on state oppression and corporate crime to the exclusion of other harms that the source pivots to discuss a significant contemporary variant or evolution within critical criminology. Semiology. Okay, you mentioned that earlier. Defined as the study of social harm. That sounds like a deliberate attempt to move beyond the potentially restrictive legal concept of crime. What is the intention behind this perspective? Well, the core intention of semiology is pretty radical. It's to significantly extend the legitimate parameters of criminological study. It wants to move deliberately and decisively away from the traditional limited focus that is confined solely to acts defined as injurious by the criminal law. The statutory offenses like theft, burglary, assault, criminal damage, and so on.
So it's explicitly rejecting the legal definition of crime as the necessary starting point or boundary for study.
Absolutely. Semiology argues that using legal definitions arbitrarily restricts the scope of inquiry, often reflecting the interests of the powerful who shape the law, rather than reflecting the true landscape of harm. Its aim is to establish that a vast range of harms, far broader than those captured by criminal law, could and indeed should be included as the central focal concern of criminological investigation.
What kind of harms are we talking about here?
Well, the source lists examples that people like Schwendinger were already pointing to way back in 1970, such as sexism, racism, imperialism, and economic exploitation, things not typically found in criminal codes, but which cause immense suffering.
And contemporary semiologists.
They continue this, and the source notes they sometimes look at their former colleagues, the left realists, who we'll discuss later, and argue that even they remain too trapped within a narrow legal definition of crime. The fundamental goal of these semiologists is to look beyond the legally defined concept of crime, to discover and analyze where the most dangerous threats and risks to our physical safety, our health or security, and our general well-being actually lie.
So what sorts of things does semiology include that go beyond traditional crime definitions?
The source provides a compelling list, things like poverty itself, malnutrition, environmental pollution, often legal or poorly regulated, medical negligence, routine breaches of workplace health and safety laws, which might be civil matters but cause death and injury, corporate corruption, state violence and surveillance, genocide, and widespread human rights violations.
That's a huge range.
It is. And Muncie is quoted from 2000, making the crucial point that these social harms, which often fall outside the scope of criminal law, have more widespread and damaging consequences than most of the behaviors and incidents that currently make up the problem of crime. This is a direct challenge to conventional priorities and where we focus our attention and resources.
When did this semiological agenda really start gaining traction, according to the text? When did people start seriously talking about harm instead of just crime?
The source suggests that by the 1990s, the recognition of these broader social harms was beginning to be identified as a legitimate focus of criminological inquiry, as documented by Muncie and McLaughlin in 1996. A key part of this was the increasing focus on human rights denial, which Stan Cohen was discussing in 1993.
Human rights denial. How did that connect?
Well, it wasn't just about adding specific human rights offenses to legal codes. It was about recognizing the routine legal transgressions and harmful activities employed by those with political and economic power, and, crucially, their ability to deny, conceal, or redefine the harms they inflict, often operating with impunity under the very protection of the law, or because the law simply didn't cover their actions. In a similar vein, the source points out that it had taken roughly 20 years of persistent feminist inquiry to fundamentally challenge the prevailing assumption that violence, danger, and risk were primarily confined to public spaces like the streets or maybe the corridors of corporate power.
Right. The focus was on public crime.
Yes. Feminist research, particularly focusing on male violence in the home, revealed the pervasive presence of serious harm within seemingly private domestic settings. Recognizing male violence and opening up the whole question of violent masculinities, as the work of scholars like Segal, Campbell, and Jefferson did, significantly extended the conception of what constitutes the crime problem. It forced the inclusion of previously hidden, ignored, or pathologized forms of harm.
So this perspective, along with feminism and human rights focus, helped bring many previously hidden crimes or maybe unacknowledged harms into the mainstream discussion.
Exactly. The source highlights what it sees as at least a partial emergence of hidden crime onto the mainstream agenda, influenced significantly by these critical perspectives. The tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence in the UK and his family's absolutely relentless campaign for justice is cited as a pivotal event.
How so?
It catapulted the issues of racial violence and hate crime right to the forefront of concerns for law enforcement and community safety agencies in the early 21st century, forcing systemic change, at least on paper. Similarly, the concept of state crime, encompassing things like illegal arms dealings, complicity in genocide, torture, illegal invasions, became a much more consistent focus of news coverage and international attention following conflicts like those in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq. This led to increased public and political support for mechanisms like the International Criminal Court or war crimes tribunals.
And it extended even beyond human-on-human harm.
Yes. The source notes some interesting examples. A long-running campaign against the live transport of animals, for instance, brought animal rights explicitly into legitimate crime discourse, framing cruelty and harm to animals as a serious societal problem, not just a niche concern. Similarly, there was increasing recognition, often driven by campaigning groups and lawsuits, of the culpable negligence of major tobacco and food companies who knowingly marketed unsafe, life-threatening substances for decades while actively denying their harmful effects.
And even government policy started being framed in this way.
Yes, the source observes that it became increasingly common to find numerous aspects of social, environmental, and economic policy being described and debated within a crime discourse, or at least a harm discourse. Things like housing policy failures leading to youth homelessness being framed as a societal harm, road building decisions impacting pollution and public health, the devastating impact of third world debt, the ethics of the international arms trade, and the unchecked power and greed of corporations leading to financial crises. Criminology provides a framework to connect these seemingly disparate issues under the broader umbrella of social harm.
Okay, so criminology clearly wants to look far, far beyond the legal definition of crime. How does this perspective fundamentally challenge the very concept of crime itself, as traditionally understood?
Well, for criminologists, the source makes it crystal clear. The concept of crime, as it is legally defined and traditionally studied by mainstream criminology, is fundamentally flawed. And the key reason is because it lacks a corresponding explicit conception of power.
Power is the missing piece.
It's the absolute central piece, the very power to label certain harmful acts as crime, thereby making them visible, subject to investigation and potentially sanction, while simultaneously keeping other, often far more devastating, harms invisible or defining them as being beyond criminal sanction, maybe calling them unfortunate accidents or economic externalities or necessary acts of war. This power imbalance, semiologists argue, lies at the very heart of the problem with working solely within traditional notions of the problem of crime. The source argues that this legalistic notion of crime, constrained by what the law chooses to define at any given time, offers only a particularly limited vision of the vast landscape of human suffering and risk.
It's too narrow.
Far too narrow. It overlooks a huge range of everyday misfortunes, dangers, chronic harms, risks, and injuries that are a routine part of life for many, many people, but which never enter the realm of official criminal statistics or mainstream criminological focus. So, if the true goal of criminology is to reveal, understand, and ultimately reduce human suffering and inequality, then the concept of crime itself must be rejected as its sole justification and object of inquiry. That's Munsey's argument from 2000. It's simply too narrow and too politically compromised a lens.
So what does Munsey suggest is the necessary first step in this process he calls decriminalizing criminology? How do we start thinking differently?
According to the source, the first stage in decriminalizing criminology is actually quite straightforward, at least conceptually. It's simply recognizing a basic reality, that a great number of damaging events and harmful behaviors that affect people's lives are objectively far more serious in their consequences than many of the incidents that currently make up the bulk of the official crime problem as reported by police and focused on by the criminal justice system.
And this stands in stark contrast to the daily work of law enforcement, right? Their priorities seem different.
Absolutely. The source points out the ironic contrast here. Many incidents that preoccupy law enforcement agencies and the criminal justice system, things like petty theft, shoplifting, low-level recreational drug use, vandalism, public brawls, minor antisocial behavior, would arguably not score particularly high on any objective scale of serious harm or life-altering impact for society as a whole.
They take up a lot of time and resources.
A huge amount of police time, court resources, prison space, and media attention. Conversely, the risk of suffering many of those crimes defined by the state as serious things like aggravated assault, robbery, homicide, while obviously terrifying and devastating for victims, might seem statistically negligible for most people compared to common everyday risks like workplace injury, deaths caused by air pollution, or mortality rates from avoidable diseases linked to poverty or poor diet.
So semiology wants us to recalibrate our sense of risk and harm.
Fundamentally, yes. To reorient our understanding of where the real, widespread, and most damaging harm in society actually lies, rather than just focusing on what the criminal law happens to label as crime. And importantly, semiology proposes dealing with these harms very differently than the traditional criminal justice system deals with crime. It argues that pain, suffering, and injury should be dealt with not primarily as criminal events that automatically deserve legal findings of guilt, punishment, and social exclusion, but rather as conflicts and troubles that require processes like negotiation, mediation, and arbitration to find resolution and repair the harm done.
So the emphasis shifts dramatically from blame and punishment towards finding resolutions and actually repairing harm.
Precisely. The source mentions the bold proposal by Bianchi back in 1986 that the very definition of crime should be reconceptualized in terms of tort and dispute, essentially seeing them as civil wrongs between parties, and that criminal law as we know it should ideally be replaced by reparative law.
Replace criminal law entirely, that's ambitious.
Extremely ambitious, yes. But from this perspective, the complex machinery of crime control would be subordinated to the principles of a wider social justice agenda. This isn't just about handling individual cases differently. It requires governments and the wider community to recognize fundamental issues like disadvantage, difference, and diversity, and to acknowledge a collective responsibility for enhancing the personal and social development of all citizens, basically, addressing the root causes of harm proactively, rather than just reacting punitively after the fact.
Right. And the concept of redress is central to this alternative approach, isn't it? What does redress mean in this context?
It is absolutely fundamental. The concept of redress, as described by DeHaan in 1990 and detailed in the source, carries a much broader and more flexible set of meanings than just punishment. It ranges from the immediate goal to put right, repair, rectify something suffered or complained of, to the more systemic aim to correct, amend, reform, or do away with a bad or faulty state of things.
So it's both individual repair and systemic change.
Potentially, yes. It sounds like a concept that allows for a response to harm without immediately locking into the rigid, punitive framework of crime and punishment which dominates our current system.
Exactly. It provides an opportunity, a framework for dealing with social problems or conflicts, including those we currently label as crime, through potentially more constructive venues like neighborhood or community-based forums rather than solely relying on adversarial criminal courts.
And the goal becomes different, too.
Yes, the primary pursuit becomes compensation or reconciliation between the parties involved, focusing on repairing the damage and perhaps the relationships, rather than the state-driven pursuit of retaliation or simply allocating blame and imposing pain. DeHaan is quoted making a key distinction here. To claim redress, he says, is merely to assert that an undesirable event has taken place and that something needs to be done about it. It carries no implications of what sort of reaction would be appropriate.
So it doesn't prejudge the outcome. Right. He continues, it puts forth the claim for a procedure rather than a specific result. Punitive claims already implied in defining an event as a crime are opened up to rational debate. This shows how the concept of redress, precisely because it doesn't presuppose punishment, opens up space for more varied, potentially more constructive, more tailored responses to harm.
That's a really profound rethinking of the entire response to harmful behavior, isn't it? What is the ultimate semiological aim then, as summarized by the source?
As summarized by Stan Cohen in 1994 and cited in the text, the ultimate semiological aim is really about shifting priorities. to prioritize practices that integrate rather than exclude, to reduce or, if possible, abolish deliberately inflicted pain, like imprisonment, and fundamentally to seek restoration rather than retribution. It's a vision focused on healing and prevention, not just punishment and control. And Muncie, writing in 1998, adds a crucial point about why this kind of radical rethinking is so necessary but often so difficult to achieve. He argues that working solely within established criminological or criminal justice discourses essentially excludes any possibility of imaginative rethinking.
Because the existing frameworks are too powerful.
Exactly. These discourses are powerful and self-reinforcing. They shape what questions get asked and what answers seem plausible. Therefore, Muncie argues, important critical work is needed just to expose how these orthodox knowledges of crime and the criminal justice system are constructed, maintained, and used. This critical exposure, according to Muncie, is essential just to open up the space needed to even consider and pursue challenging alternatives like semiology.
This semiological framework certainly pushes the boundaries, maybe even redraws them entirely, for what we consider criminology. But is it without its critics or potential challenges itself? Our source notes some points of caution, even from proponents.
Yes, absolutely. Even proponents like Muncie acknowledge potential pitfalls. Muncie himself, in his 2000 work cited earlier, sounds a significant note of caution regarding the whole semiological project. He highlights the potential for a really unwelcome and totally unintended consequence. The widespread criminalization of all undesirable behavior. If a social harm agenda were to be successfully incorporated into mainstream political and criminological discourse without sufficient care and critical awareness.
Hang on. So instead of replacing crime with harm and becoming less punitive, it could actually lead to more things being criminalized under the banner of preventing harm.
That's the danger Muncie points to, yes. He uses the example of community safety initiatives. These were initially promoted by liberal reformers as a way to broaden crime prevention beyond traditional policing, focusing on community well-being and proactive measures. Seemed like a good idea. However, according to the source, these initiatives were subsequently appropriated by political forces, specifically mentioning New Labour in the UK at the time as a means of targeting the antisocial. So, community safety became a tool used to justify all manner of punitive interventions, from imposing curfews on young people to advocating for increased use of custody for relatively minor disturbances or behaviors deemed antisocial. Muncie's point, drawing on this example, is that these emergent discourses around community safety didn't fundamentally challenge the concept of crime or the state's power to punish. Instead, they were simply absorbed and used by the existing system to expand the scope of what the state could criminalize and control, all under the seemingly benign banner of reducing harm.
So the language of harm can be co-opted.
It can be, yes. This happened, Muncie argues, precisely because these initiatives failed to recognize the multifaceted and sometimes contradictory nature of harm itself, and they didn't fundamentally challenge the underlying power structures that define what counts as problematic behavior.
Are there other limitations mentioned regarding the very concept of harm as a central organizing principle? Does it capture everything?
Yes, the source points out another interesting limitation. While the concept of harm offers great potential for broadening focus, it currently operates largely within a negative discursive framework.
Negative meaning.
Meaning we primarily think of harm in terms of trouble, injury, loss, and fear. Bad things we want to avoid. However, the source suggests that harm isn't only a source of fear or trouble for everyone. It is also, in a complex and perhaps disturbing way, a source of fascination, pleasure, and entertainment for audiences.
Entertainment? How so?
Well, the source encourages us to think about this by simply observing television listings, looking at the content of mass circulation newspapers, or browsing the shelves of fiction books. Crime narratives, murder mysteries, gangster films, true crime documentaries are absolutely everywhere, consumed avidly by millions.
True. The true crime genre is huge.
It is. This demonstrates the extent to which audiences perceive and consume crime, not just as a serious social problem to be eradicated, but also as a major source of entertainment, drama, excitement, and titillation. This phenomenon, where harm is also a source of fascination or pleasure, casts some doubt on the universal applicability of harm as always connoting trouble, fear, and loss in a purely negative sense for everyone. And it also mentions that for the participants themselves, those who actually commit acts of harm or deviance, the pleasure derived from creating harm, doing wrong, or maybe just breaking established boundaries and experiencing a thrill is also a significant part of the equation for them.
So simple models of harm avoidance don't capture the full picture of why people engage in harmful behavior. It can be attractive.
It seems so, yes. The source points out that exploring this aspect, the pleasure, the excitement, the transgression, the fascination associated with harm and rule breaking, is a key focus for scholars working in the related field of cultural criminology, hinting perhaps at potential future topics we might delve into.
Okay, let's bring it back, maybe loop back to the economic context one last time, as the source seems to explicitly tie this critical perspective into economic cycles near the end. How did critical criminology align with periods of economic hardship, particularly the one alluded to around the time the source was written, around 2008, 2009?
Yeah, the source explains that the arrival of mass unemployment in the late 1970s and early 1980s, following that period of relative post-war prosperity, allowed critical criminologists to forcefully reassert their traditional argument that deprivation is a main cause of working-class crime. The link between economic hardship and certain types of crime became much more evident and harder to ignore for a wider public.
So hard times brought the theory back into focus.
It certainly gave it more resonance. The source then jumps forward to the time of its writing, roughly 2008 or 2009, which was characterized by the beginnings of that major global economic correction, often referred to as the credit crunch.
Right, the financial crisis.
Exactly. The source describes this period as potentially turning into an economic slump not seen since the depths of the 1930s Great Depression. It frames this crisis, perhaps a bit simplistically but capturing the mood, as seemingly being the outcome of a credit crunch, where boom conditions were artificially sustained for years by banks lending vast sums of money that didn't really exist, often to people with dubious ability to repay, creating a huge, unstable bubble.
That description of the credit crunch and its origins sounds strikingly familiar, unfortunately.
It does, doesn't it? The source quotes the then Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, Alistair Darling, telling the public in October 2008 that the UK faced its worst economic crisis in 60 years. This official acknowledgement really highlighted the severity of the situation they were facing.
And what was the predicted impact on crime levels in the UK, according to projections mentioned in the source at the time?
Well, not long after that stark statement from the Chancellor, a draft letter from the Home Office was leaked to the press. It reportedly advised government ministers that crime levels would inevitably increase as a direct result of the economic downturn.
What kinds of crime?
Specifically, the letter predicted rising property crime theft, burglary presumably driven by need or opportunity, an increase in violent crime, possibly linked to social stress and disorder, and notably increased hostility towards migrants, perhaps as scapegoats. The Home Office minister at the time, Tony McNulty, his response to the leaked letter, as reported by the BBC, was rather blunt. He apparently called the letter a statement of the blindingly obvious, noting that it was clear from past experience, particularly the recession in the early 1990s, that crime would likely rise during an economic slowdown.
Just common sense, basically.
Although, the source adds a crucial caveat. The conditions during the 1990s recession were probably nowhere near as severe as those that were developing during the 2008 crisis, which were genuinely drawing comparisons, rightly or wrongly, to the 1930s. So the source argues that such changed socioeconomic circumstances, widespread job losses, deep financial insecurity, visibly increasing inequality, provide fertile ground for critical criminological research and analysis. These conditions strongly support arguments, it suggests, for a return to more traditional Marxist analysis, as someone like Russell argued back in 2006.
Why does Russell argue for the continued relevance of Marxism specifically in this context? Had it fallen out of favor?
Russell observed, according to the source, that since the early 1990s, perhaps linked to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the apparent triumph of capitalism, there had been deliberate attempts to marginalize or exclude Marxism from critical criminology, often viewing it as an outdated or discredited mode of analysis. However, Russell argued that, particularly in the face of a major capitalist crisis like the credit crunch, Marxist analysis remains as relevant as ever for understanding the dynamics of crime, the functions of the criminal justice system, and the role of the state in managing social inequality and its consequences. The source also considers the specific impact of such a crisis on white-collared professionals, those middle-class groups who, in more prosperous times, were often not seen as members of the working class, often by themselves included, and who probably felt relatively immune to the negative extremes of the economic trade cycle.
But the crisis put their security at risk too, didn't it? Suddenly, redundancy wasn't just for factory workers.
Precisely. They become increasingly proletarianized victims of the downturn, finding both their homes through mortgage defaults and their professional jobs suddenly at significant risk. The source suggests that the psychological effect on those with previously strong conventional bonds to the established social order and socioeconomic status, who are suddenly cast adrift in unfamiliar and significantly impoverished circumstances, could have major implications for crime and criminality.
How so?
Well, it doesn't spell it out explicitly, but it implies that desperation or disillusionment could push even formerly respectable individuals towards behaviors previously associated mainly with more marginalized groups, perhaps fraud, theft, or even just increased social unrest. It highlights how systemic economic issues, driven by the political economy, can impact everyone, further validating the critical focus on these larger structures as drivers of crime and harm across the social spectrum.
Wow, okay. That was a comprehensive deep dive into a truly challenging perspective. Critical criminology, as laid out in our source from Hopkins Burke, really forces us to look beyond the individual offender, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It forces us to gravel with how societal structures, power dynamics, and deep-seated inequality might not just influence, but actively produce and even define crime itself.
It really does. It compels us to confront the uncomfortable idea that what gets called crime and who gets labeled a criminal is deeply intertwined with who holds power in society, the power to define, the power to enforce, and the power to escape sanction. It starkly contrasts the highly visible harms of street crime with the often hidden, yet arguably far more devastating landscape of social harm produced by corporations or even state actions, and it pushes the boundaries of what criminology should even be studying.
And while it faces legitimate critiques, as the source points out,
Which it does.
it raises profoundly important questions about justice, about social order, and about the true cost of power and inequality in our societies.
Absolutely critical question.
This deep dive has certainly pulled out some fascinating insights. It suggests crime isn't just about individuals breaking rules, but maybe a complex outcome of deeper inequalities and power struggles. Or, perhaps more cynically, as some argue, it's intentionally defined and policed in ways that protect the interests of the powerful while controlling the less powerful.
It leaves you with a lot to think about regarding the foundations of our legal and social systems.
Definitely. So we leave you, the listener, with this provocative thought to consider. How does your understanding of crime and justice change when you view it not just through the familiar lens of legal definitions and individual responsibility, but through this critical lens of power, oppression, and the vast landscape of social harm?
And, as our source tells us, some of those former radical criminologists, partly responding to the critiques we discussed, particularly about ignoring the reality of street crime and victimization, went on to develop a different, though related, perspective. It's sometimes termed left realism, and it attempts to reconcile the radical critique of power with the everyday reality of crime experienced by working-class communities.
So that's where the story goes next.
That alternative perspective is exactly what we'll be exploring in our next deep dive, based on the subsequent sections of the book.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the challenging world of critical criminology. We hope it's given you a lot to think about. We'll see you next time.